I never planned to lie to the woman I married, but looking back now, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse I've owned for 22 years, watching the sun go down over the pecan grove, I think that one small omission, that single thing I chose not to say, was the only reason I still have any of this left. My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old. I live outside of Greenville, South Carolina, on a piece of land my late wife Dorothy and I spent 3 decades building together. We raised our son Marcus here. We planted every one of those pecan trees together. One spring when Marcus was 11, and kept dropping the saplings because he was more interested in the tadpoles in the creek than in helping us dig. Dorothy laughed so hard that afternoon she had to sit down in the dirt. That's the kind of woman she was. She passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to gone. I didn't know a person could disappear so fast. For 2 years after, I barely left the property. Marcus would drive up from Columbia on weekends, and I'd see him looking at me with that careful expression young people get when they're worried about you but don't know how to say it. My neighbor Harold, who I've known since before either of us had gray hair, started showing up on Tuesday evenings with a 6-pack and no explanation, just sitting with me on this same porch until I could remember how to talk again. Slowly, I came back to myself. I started going to church again. I started attending the monthly meetings at the County Agricultural Cooperative, where local landowners talk about soil conditions and water rights and the kind of slow, serious things that matter when your livelihood is tied to the ground beneath your feet. I own the farmhouse and 48 acres here in Greenville, and 2 commercial properties in town, a rental warehouse space and a small strip of office units I lease to a dentist and an insurance agency. Dorothy and I never talked about those things loudly. We lived modestly, we drove used trucks, we put money away quietly. That's where I met Renee. She was new to the cooperative meetings, recently relocated from Atlanta, she said, after a difficult divorce. She had a daughter in her mid-20s and a teenage grandson she was helping to raise. She was warm. She laughed easily. She had opinions about cover crops and water retention that were actually informed. And in a room full of people who'd been having the same conversations for 20 years, that was something. We started talking after meetings. Then talking turned into coffee. Then coffee turned into dinners. Marcus met her twice before I said anything serious. The second time, driving home, he was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, "Dad, she seems nice. You've only known her 4 months. What do you actually know about her life before Atlanta?" I told him I knew enough. He nodded in that way that meant he disagreed but was choosing to respect me. He was 31 years old and still trying to figure out how to be my son without becoming my parent, and I loved him for the effort. What I had not told Renee, what I chose, almost without deciding to, not to mention, was the full picture of what I owned. She knew I was a farmer. She knew I lived on land outside of town. I never described the acreage. I never mentioned the commercial properties. When she asked what I did, I told her I managed the property and kept the books, which was true. I just left out that I was managing and keeping books for myself. I want to be honest about why I did it. Part of it was caution. Harold had told me stories about men he knew, widowers with assets, who'd been approached with affection that turned out to have a price tag attached. Part of it was still being Dorothy's husband in some corner of my heart, protective of what we'd built together. And part of it, the part I'm least proud of, was that I was lonely enough to be afraid that if I said too much too soon, something would shift. So I said less. I told myself I'd tell her everything once I was sure. I proposed in the spring. We married in June at the church. Small ceremony, just family and a handful of close friends. Marcus stood beside me. He smiled the whole time, and only someone who knew him well would have noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. Renee's daughter, Pamela, was there with her husband, and Renee's grandson, Devante, who was 16, sat in the third pew in a suit that was slightly too big for him and looked at his phone through most of the service. I told myself that was just teenagers. I told myself a lot of things. We came back to the farmhouse that evening. I had cleaned the whole place, put fresh flowers on the table, cooked the meal myself, roast chicken and the collard greens Dorothy used to make, which I'd spent 6 months learning to replicate. It felt important to me that this house feel welcoming, that it feel like a beginning. Renee walked through the rooms slowly that first night, running her hand along the countertops, looking out the kitchen window toward the grove in the dark. She said it was beautiful. She said she couldn't believe I'd kept a place like this so quietly. I should have paid attention to the way she said that, but I was happy, and happy people don't always hear what's underneath words. The next morning was a Saturday. I was up early, the way I always am, coffee made before 6. Renee came downstairs later, around 8:30, in a good mood, and we sat on the porch together with our cups, and it felt for that hour like something that could work. Then Pamela arrived. She hadn't called ahead. She parked her car at the edge of the gravel drive and came up the porch steps with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing what they were going to say. Renee didn't seem surprised to see her. That was the first thing I noticed. No, I didn't know you were coming. No, why didn't you call? Just a nod, almost like acknowledgement of something expected. Pamela sat down across from us and said she wanted to talk about the arrangement. I asked her what arrangement she meant. She looked at her mother, then back at me, and said that since we were all family now, it made sense to have a clear picture of things. She wanted to know about the lease income from the commercial properties. I kept my face calm. I asked her what she knew about commercial properties. She said her mother had mentioned I managed some rental units in town. She said she was asking because she and her husband were thinking about expanding their business. They ran a cleaning service out of Atlanta, and if there was office space available at family rates, that seemed like a conversation worth having. While we were at it, she said she also wanted to talk about Devante. He needed a stable environment, a place to grow up with some land around him. She'd been thinking he could come live at the farmhouse, his own room, fresh air, all of that. I looked at Renee. She was looking at her coffee cup. I told Pamela I appreciated her thinking ahead, and that I'd be happy to talk about any of that once my wife and I had a chance to discuss things between ourselves first. Pamela nodded. She stayed for another hour talking about her business, her son, the cost of living in Atlanta. She ate 3 of the biscuits I had made. Then she left. As soon as her car was gone, I turned to Renee and said gently that I was a little surprised by that visit. Renee said, Pamela was just looking out for the family. I said I understood that, but that some of what Pamela mentioned, the commercial leases, Devante moving in, those felt like significant topics for a conversation that should have started with just the two of us. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Walter, you've been holding things close for a long time. This is a marriage. We should be transparent with each other." I agreed with that. I said I was ready to be fully transparent. I asked if she'd like to go first. She looked at me. Then she said that Pamela was going to need help with Devante's school fees in the fall, that the farmhouse had more than enough room, that it would be good for everyone. I said I'd think about it. Over the next week, the shape of things became clearer. Renee made small comments about the size of the grocery budget, about whether the truck I drove was really suited to a man in my position, about how the farmhouse could use updating. She asked twice about the lease agreements on the commercial properties. She framed it as curiosity, as a wife wanting to understand the household finances. But she was asking specific things, the names of the tenants, the contract renewal dates, the name of the property management contact. I answered vaguely. I told her I had everything handled through my accountant and my attorney, and that I'd set up a time for the three of us to sit down together once we'd had a chance to settle in properly. She didn't like that answer. I could see it. But she accepted it. Devante arrived the following Wednesday. No conversation had concluded. No agreement had been made. He simply showed up with 2 duffel bags and a backpack, and Renee told me his room was the one at the end of the hall, Marcus's old room, and that she'd already spoken to the school district about enrollment. I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at my son's old room with a teenage boy I had met once disappearing into it. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and called Harold. Harold listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Brother, you need to call James. James is my attorney. I've known him for 15 years. He handled our estate planning after Dorothy got sick, and he's the kind of man who doesn't waste words." I called James that same evening from the workshop, with the door shut. He asked me a few careful questions. Then he said, "Walter, are any of your properties titled in a way that would give a spouse automatic access to them?" I told him we had signed a prenuptial agreement, something I had insisted on quietly weeks before the wedding, which Renee had signed without much comment. James said, "Good. Then sit tight. Let me do some checking. I want to tell you about the moment I understood the full picture, because it didn't come the way I expected. It came from Devante. The boy had been in the house for 4 days. He was mostly quiet, mostly on his phone, would say yes, sir, and no, sir, when I spoke to him, which I appreciated. On Saturday morning, I was in the workshop repairing a fence post, and he appeared in the doorway and asked if he could help. I was surprised enough that I said yes without thinking about it. We worked for a couple of hours without talking much. He was actually useful, paid attention, held things where I needed them, didn't complain. Around noon, I made us sandwiches, and we sat on the tailgate of the truck and ate. He said, almost casually, not looking at me, "My grandma told my mom this place is worth a lot. She said once things were settled, there'd be money to help with the business." I asked him when she'd said that. He thought about it. "Before the wedding," he said. "Maybe a month before." I nodded. I thanked him for helping me. I kept my voice even. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Renee after dinner, and I told her I wanted to have an honest conversation. I told her I'd been feeling like there were expectations in our home that we hadn't agreed to together, and that I was concerned about the pace of things. I told her I cared about making this work, but that I needed us to be on the same page. She started calmly. She said she understood. She was sorry if things had moved fast. She just wanted her family to be secure. Then I asked her one direct question. Had she known, before we married, more about my financial situation than she'd let on? The pause before she answered told me more than the answer did. She said she'd done some research, public records, property filings. She said any reasonable person would want to know what they were walking into. I said I understood that. Then I asked her why, if she'd known, she hadn't simply asked me directly. She didn't answer. I excused myself. I went to the workshop and I sat alone for a long time with the lights off, listening to the pecan trees move in the wind. James called me the following Monday with information I had half expected and still didn't enjoy hearing. He'd spoken to a contact in Atlanta who knew of Renee's divorce proceedings. There had been an attorney involved who specialized in asset acquisition cases, the kind of cases where one party enters a relationship specifically to access another party's holdings. The divorce she described as difficult had actually concluded with a financial settlement that raised questions about how it had been structured. James was careful about what he said and what he didn't say, but the shape of it was clear. I made my decision quietly, the way I make most decisions. I sat down with Renee on a Tuesday evening. I told her I wanted to be fully transparent with her, as she'd said a marriage required. I told her I'd been consulting with my attorney about our financial structure, and then I told her what I owned. All of it. The farmhouse, the 48 acres, the warehouse lease, the office units, my investment accounts, the full picture, which was more than she'd found in public records. I watched her expression move through several things. Then I told her I also wanted her to know that every one of those assets was protected under the prenuptial agreement she had signed, that my attorney had reviewed everything, that nothing she could claim access to through the marriage would hold up under the terms she'd agreed to. She was very still. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I was sorry it had come to this because I had genuinely wanted it to work. I told her that Devante was welcome to finish out the month so there wasn't disruption to his schooling, and that I would pay for his first semester's fees where he currently was enrolled, because none of what had happened was his fault and he deserved better than to be a piece in someone else's plan. She left 2 weeks later. Pamela came with a truck and they took what Renee had brought. Devante hugged me before he got in the car, which I hadn't expected. I told him he was a good kid. I meant it. Marcus came up that weekend. We walked the property together in the late afternoon, out through the pecan grove, down to the creek where he used to chase tadpoles. He didn't say I told you so. He just walked beside me. After a while, he put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, the way men do when they don't have the right words but want you to know they're there. Harold came by that Tuesday, same as always, with a six-pack and no explanation needed. I think about Dorothy sometimes when I'm out in the grove. I think about what she would say. I believe she would tell me I was too trusting, and then tell me I was too suspicious, and then laugh because both things would be true at the same time, and she was always more comfortable with contradiction than I am. I learned something through all of this, and I want to say it plainly because I think it matters. Protecting what you've built is not the same as being closed off. It is not the same as refusing love. It is something Dorothy and I understood without ever having to discuss it, that what we made together was worth guarding, not because money is the most important thing, but because the labor and the love behind it were real. And real things deserve to be protected by people who understand their value. If you're at a point in your life where someone new has come along and you feel that pull toward hope and companionship, I am not here to tell you to resist it. I am here to tell you to move slowly. Talk to your children. Talk to your attorney. Listen when the people who love you without anything to gain start asking careful questions, and trust that voice inside you, the one that goes quiet when something isn't right. Mine tried to tell me. I just wasn't ready to hear it early enough. I'm ready now. Tonight I sat on this porch until the stars came out, the way Dorothy and I used to do in the good years. The pecan grove was dark and still. The land was exactly where I left it, and I allowed myself for the first time in a while to feel grateful, not just for what I kept, but for what I learned, and for the people standing beside me when it mattered most.